the city is silent. Not the silence of sleep. Not the silence of a quiet morning before the merchants arrive and the children run and the priests begin their chants. This is the other kind, the permanent kind. The kind that moves in after everyone has left and never moves out again. Somewhere beneath a layer of jungle root and monsoon sediment and 8 centuries of forgetfulness, there is a road. It runs perfectly straight for 4 kilometers. The stone was quarried 20 miles away. The engineers who designed it calculated load distribution, drainage, elevation. They built it to last forever. It lasted longer than they did. History is full of cities that should still exist. Civilizations that were not weak, not primitive, not failures. They were thriving. They were sophisticated. And then, across a span of time that, measured against human ambition, is terrifyingly short, they were gone. This is not a story about any one of them. This is a story about the pattern they all share, and what that pattern means for every civilization that comes after, including this one. Subscribe now for more dark history stories that history class never taught you. Let us begin in the Indus Valley. Around 2600 BCE, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a civilization emerged that was, by any honest measure, ahead of its time. The city of Mohenjo-daro covered more than 250 hectares. It was home to somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people, a figure that rivals the population of ancient Rome at its peak. But unlike Rome, Mohenjo-daro had running water, not as a luxury, as infrastructure. The city's engineers had designed a network of covered brick drains running beneath nearly every street, connecting private homes to public collection channels. Homes had bathrooms. Bathrooms had drainage. The city had public wells evenly distributed so that no resident was more than a short walk from clean water. They built with standardized bricks. The same ratio, length to width to height, appears in ruins across the entire Indus Valley region, spanning more than 1 million square kilometers. This was not coincidence. It was planning. It was coordination on a continental scale. Archaeologists have found weights and measures at Indus Valley sites that are precise to fractions of a gram. Nay, evidence of trade networks stretching to Mesopotamia. Evidence of a writing system, one that has never been deciphered. A language that died with the civilization that spoke it, leaving behind only its symbols, sealed and unreadable, like a letter no one can open. By 1900 BCE, it was over. The great cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, had been abandoned, not destroyed in a single catastrophic event, not conquered by a named enemy. They simply emptied. The people dispersed, mostly eastward, toward the Ganges plain. The infrastructure they left behind was so well built that some of the drains they constructed have been found intact, 4,000 years later, still in the ground. The civilization that built them left no explanation. Now, travel west, cross the Aegean, arrive on the island of Crete, where the Minoan civilization had been flourishing since approximately 2700 BCE. The Minoans were not a people history tends to linger on. If they leave no empire behind in the way we typically define it, no military campaigns inscribed on triumphal columns, no long dynasty of named kings. What they leave behind are palaces. The Palace of Knossos alone covers nearly 1,300 rooms. Storerooms packed with ceramic jars that once held oil and grain and wine in quantities sufficient to sustain a major regional trading hub. Frescoes on the walls, dolphins, athletes, and women in elaborate dress, painted with a confidence and naturalism that suggests a culture comfortable with beauty, at ease in its own sophistication. The Minoans dominated Aegean trade for centuries. Their pottery and goods have been found in Egypt, the Levant, mainland Greece. They were connected. They were prosperous. The palace at Knossos was, by the standards of the Bronze Age, an astonishing place to exist. Around 1450 BCE, almost all of the major Minoan palatial centers were destroyed simultaneously. Archaeologists find thick ash layers, collapsed walls, evidence of fire. The leading theory for centuries pointed to the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, which exploded sometime around 1600 to 1500 BCE in what may have been one of the largest volcanic events in human history. tsunamis, ash fall, agricultural disruption. The argument was elegant, appealing. Catastrophic geology wiping out a sophisticated culture in one seismic moment. Except, the chronology doesn't quite fit. Knossos survived the Thera eruption by at least a century. It was occupied afterward, possibly by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The story of the Minoan collapse is more complicated than a single volcanic event, more tangled, more uncertain. Something happened across a compressed period of decades that ended a civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years. What, precisely remains unclear. Now, cross an ocean, move forward in time by 3,000 years, but move back in terms of what we understand. The classic Maya civilization reached its peak between approximately 250 CE and 900 CE. At its height, the Maya world comprised dozens of powerful city-states spread across modern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Caracol, and Palenque were not small settlements. And Tikal alone may have housed a population of 100,000 or more. Its temples rose 60 meters above the jungle canopy. Its plazas were engineered to carry the sound of a speaking voice across hundreds of meters without amplification. The Maya understood astronomy with a precision that challenges easy explanation. They calculated the length of the solar year to a degree of accuracy comparable to modern measurement. They tracked the movements of Venus across a 584-day cycle. They maintained interlocking calendar systems, including one measuring time in cycles of over 5,000 years, that required sustained transgenerational record-keeping. Knowledge was not invented once and forgotten. It was cultivated, refined, passed down. The Maya were running a civilization that required institutional memory spanning centuries. Between roughly 800 CE and 1000 CE, the southern lowland cities collapsed in rapid succession. The construction of major monuments stopped. The populations of once thriving cities dropped catastrophically. Tikal, which had been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years, was largely abandoned by 900 CE. The jungle moved in. Within 2 centuries, the temples were swallowed. Within 5 centuries, they were invisible. The Maya did not disappear as a people. Their descendants still live in the same regions today, speaking related languages, carrying cultural continuities that have persisted despite everything. Thus, but the classic Maya civilization, the network of powerful cities, the elaborate political structures, the monument-building tradition, the sophisticated astronomical institutions that collapsed. Rapidly, comprehensively. Archaeologists can reconstruct, with extraordinary detail, how these people lived, the food they ate, the rituals they performed, the trade goods they moved across hundreds of kilometers of jungle, the texts they carved into stone, which can now be read. The names of their kings, the dates of their wars, the dedications of their temples. But why they died, why the cities emptied, why the political systems fractured, why the institutions that had functioned for centuries ceased to function, that question remains, even now, more complicated than it first appears. These 3 civilizations, the Indus Valley, the Minoan, the classic Maya, are not historical curiosities. They are not footnotes. They are among the most sophisticated human societies that ever existed, and each of them vanished in ways that their own inhabitants almost certainly did not anticipate. That is the first unsettling fact. These were not failing civilizations. They were flourishing ones. When the Indus Valley cities began to empty, they had been operating continuously for 700 years. When the Minoan palaces burned, Crete had been a center of Aegean culture for over a millennium. And when the southern Maya lowlands collapsed, the cities had endured for longer than the entirety of recorded Western history up to the present day. Duration is not protection. Sophistication is not armor. These are the lessons buried in the ruins. The question the ruins keep asking, in the silence left behind by the people who built them, is whether we are listening. In the ruins of collapsed civilizations, archaeologists have spent the last century learning to read a language written not in words but in sediment, in pollen, in oxygen isotopes, in the chemical composition of ancient lake beds. It is painstaking work. It is also revelatory. What the physical evidence reveals, across site after site and civilization after civilization, is a consistent and deeply uncomfortable pattern. These civilizations did not collapse for simple reasons. Indeed, they collapsed because multiple pressures arrived simultaneously, or in such rapid succession that the response to one crisis was overwhelmed by the emergence of the next. Around 2200 BCE, roughly the period when the Indus Valley cities began their long decline, a major climate event disrupted a wide swath of the ancient world. Paleoclimatologists call it the 4.2 kilo-year event. Sediment cores from lakes in India, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean show a sharp and sustained aridification beginning around this period. In some regions, rainfall declined by more than 30%. Rivers ran lower. Agricultural yields dropped. The timing is striking. Across the same 2 to 3 century window, the Old Kingdom of Egypt collapsed. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, centered in Mesopotamia, disintegrated. Settlements across the Levant were abandoned, and the Indus Valley cities, which had been so carefully engineered to manage water through urban infrastructure, faced an adversary their drains and reservoirs could not address. The rivers that fed the entire civilization were changing course. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which had once been a mighty seasonal waterway and may have been the Vedic Saraswati River, was drying up. Monsoonal patterns were shifting. The agricultural surpluses that fed the cities, that allowed for the specialization of labor, that allowed for the trade networks, that allowed for the complex administrative systems. All of it was predicated on water, and the water was becoming unreliable. This is the first layer of the collapse. Environmental stress. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Not a single volcanic explosion or a conquering army. Just decades of gradual agricultural deterioration. A farmer in the third generation of the decline would not have recognized it as a civilization-ending event. He would have recognized it as a bad harvest, then another bad harvest, then a decision to move the family eastward, where the water was more reliable. One family, then 10, then 10,000. But environmental stress alone does not explain most collapses. It is, in the forensic evidence of dead civilizations, rarely the murder weapon. More often, it is the condition that makes the patient susceptible. Consider Angkor. The Khmer civilization's capital at Angkor, in what is now Cambodia, was, at its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries CE, possibly the largest pre-industrial urban complex in human history. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted under the jungle canopy have revealed an urban footprint extending across nearly 1,000 square kilometers. Roads, reservoirs, temples, residential areas, infrastructure on a scale that dwarfs contemporaneous medieval European cities. The hydraulic system at Angkor was extraordinary. A network of massive reservoirs called barai, one of which measured 8 kilometers by 2 kilometers, captured and stored monsoon rainfall for distribution during the dry season. A web of canals and channels connected the reservoirs to the fields and to the city's water supply. The entire agricultural economy of the Khmer Empire was built on this system. Without the water management infrastructure, the city could not be fed. Without the city, the empire could not be administered. In the 14th and 15th centuries, that infrastructure began to fail. Tree ring records and lake sediment cores from the region document a period of extraordinary climatic volatility, alternating mega droughts and intense monsoons. The hydraulic system, which had been engineered for relatively predictable monsoon cycles, was overwhelmed. A massive flood scoured the canal networks, depositing sediment that choked the channels. Droughts then prevented adequate refilling of the reservoirs. The system that had fed 1 million people began to break down faster than it could be repaired. Simultaneously, and this is where the investigation becomes genuinely complex, Angkor was facing sustained military pressure from the Ayutthaya kingdom to the west. Trade routes were being disrupted. The political elite were under pressure from multiple directions at once. Resources that might have been invested in maintaining the hydraulic infrastructure were being diverted to defense and internal political competition. By the mid-15th century, Angkor was largely abandoned. The Khmer capital shifted south to the region of modern Phnom Penh. The canals silted up. The jungle consumed the temples, a civilization that had endured for over 5 centuries. That had built Angkor Wat, still the largest religious monument in the world, dissolved within a few generations. Not because of climate, not because of war, because of both. arriving together faster than the institutions designed to manage them could adapt. This is the second layer of collapse, the convergence problem. Individual stressors that a resilient civilization might survive in isolation become catastrophic when they arrive in combination. The Khmer hydraulic system could have weathered droughts if there had been no wars draining the maintenance budget. It might have survived the wars if climate had remained stable enough to keep the agricultural surplus flowing. It could not survive both at once. Now, consider a civilization that most people in the Western world have never heard of, Cahokia. Between approximately 1000 CE and 1200 CE, at the confluence of the Missouri, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers, in what is now the St. and Louis metropolitan area, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, rose and briefly flourished. At its peak, Cahokia may have housed a population of 10 to 20,000 people, making it larger than contemporary London. Cahokia's builders constructed more than 100 earthen mounds across the settlement's area. The largest, Monk's Mound, covers 14 acres at its base and rises 30 meters into the air. It was built in stages over several centuries. It's using an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried, without metal tools or draft animals, in baskets by human labor alone. The summit of Monk's Mound once supported a large timber structure, likely a chief's residence or a ceremonial building that would have been visible for miles across the flat Mississippi floodplain. Cahokia was a regional center of extraordinary reach. Artifacts and materials found at the site indicate trade connections extending to the Gulf Coast. At the Rocky Mountains, the Great Lakes, copper, mica, marine shells. Cahokia sat at the intersection of river networks that made it accessible to a continental-scale exchange system, and it exploited that position to become the dominant political and ceremonial center of its region for centuries. By 1350 CE, Cahokia was essentially abandoned. The population had dispersed. The mound-building tradition had ended. The city that had no name, that left no written records, that's that history forgot so thoroughly that European settlers assumed the mounds must have been built by a lost race of giants, rather than by the ancestors of indigenous Americans who were still living nearby. Cahokia was gone. Why? The sediment record reveals devastating floods from the Mississippi in the 12th century that inundated the lower portions of the city. Environmental isotope analysis of skeletons from Cahokian burial sites shows periods of nutritional stress in the population, evidence of food shortages, likely agricultural failures driven by a combination of flooding and the regional climate disruption associated with what climatologists call the medieval warm period's transition into the Little Ice Age. A political analysis of the site's archaeology suggests escalating internal conflict. The construction of a defensive palisade around the central precinct in the 12th century suggests a city increasingly at war with itself or afraid of its neighbors. The pattern repeats: environmental stress, agricultural failure, political instability, trade disruption. Not in sequence neatly, one resolved before the next arrived, but in cascade, each crisis weakening the institutional capacity to respond to the next, until the system crossed a threshold beyond which recovery was no longer possible. Great Zimbabwe offers another version of the same story. The stone-walled city at Great Zimbabwe, in what is now the southern African nation of Zimbabwe, was the capital of a powerful kingdom that controlled the gold trade between the African interior and the Swahili coast from approximately 1100 CE to 1450 CE. Then the stone enclosures at the site, built without mortar, using precisely shaped granite blocks fitted together with extraordinary skill, represent a monumental building tradition that has no direct precedent in sub-Saharan Africa. At its peak, Great Zimbabwe may have been home to 18,000 people. The kingdom it administered controlled trade routes linking the gold-producing regions of the plateau to the coastal ports of the Indian Ocean, where Swahili merchants connected the African interior to a trading network extending to Arabia, India, and beyond. Chinese porcelain has been excavated at Great Zimbabwe, Persian ceramics. The site was cosmopolitan, connected, prosperous. By the mid-15th century, the capital had been abandoned. The evidence suggests a combination of ecological degradation. The gold resources of the immediate region were becoming depleted, Elis and the local environment had been stressed by centuries of intensive occupation, and a shift in the trade routes themselves, as a rival kingdom to the north developed new connections to the Swahili coast. The economic foundation of Great Zimbabwe's power did not disappear. It moved, and a city built on that foundation could not survive the relocation. Each of these cases, Angkor, Cahokia, Great Zimbabwe, adds a new dimension to the investigation. Together, they begin to reveal not just the mechanics of individual collapses, but the architecture of systemic failure. What archaeologists and historians have found, examining these civilizations with the full toolkit of modern science, is that collapse is not an event. It is a process, and the process, in case after case, follows a recognizable shape. A civilization builds complexity. Complexity allows for specialization. Specialization creates efficiency. Efficiency generates surplus. Our surplus enables investment. Investment builds more complexity. The cycle compounds. The cities grow larger. The institutions grow more elaborate. The supply chains grow longer. The administrative systems grow more sophisticated. At every stage, the civilization becomes more capable. And at every stage, it becomes more dependent on all the other stages continuing to function. The historian Joseph Tainter, whose 1988 work on the collapse of complex societies remains one of the foundational texts in this field, articulated the central paradox. Complexity itself becomes a problem. Each additional layer of institutional response to a challenge, each new administrative office, each new military unit, each new layer of infrastructure maintenance requires resources, and as challenges compound, the resources required to maintain complexity grow faster than the resources available to fund it. At some point, the marginal return on additional investment in complexity becomes negative. The civilization is spending more to sustain itself than it is gaining from that expenditure. When that threshold is crossed, the incentive structure changes. For individuals within the failing civilization, the rational choice begins to shift from investment in the collective system toward local self-sufficiency. Farmers stop sending surplus to distant administrative centers when those centers can no longer provide security, trade access, or reliable justice. Merchants stop traveling long supply routes when the roads are no longer maintained, and the political guarantees that made trade safe have dissolved. Soldiers stop defending borders when they are no longer being paid. The collapse does not announce itself. It accumulates. It compounds. And by the time it is visible, it is usually already irreversible. If these stories haunt you as they haunt us, subscribe now and never miss another. There is a moment in the archaeology of a collapsed civilization that is, to those who study them, deeply affecting. It is not the moment of the dramatic find, the sealed tomb, the inscribed stone, the golden artifact. It is the moment of the ordinary find, the bread oven in Mohenjo-Daro that still contains carbonized grain, the unfinished fresco at Akrotiri on Thera, now abandoned mid-stroke when the volcanic eruption drove the painters from the room. The administrative clay tablets at Ugarit, a Bronze Age Levantine city destroyed around 1185 BCE, that contain letters that were never sent, requests for military assistance that arrived in the excavation, still sealed in their clay envelopes, millennia after the city they were addressed to had ceased to exist. These ordinary things carry an extraordinary weight. They are evidence not of historical forces or geopolitical pressures or climate cycles. They are evidence of people doing what people do up until the moment when the world they had always inhabited stopped working, and then stopping not because they chose to, but because there was nothing left to continue. The Late Bronze Age collapse, which occurred between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, is perhaps the most instructive single case study in the archaeology of civilizational failure. Where in the space of roughly 50 years, every major civilization around the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously collapsed or severely contracted. The Hittite Empire, which had been a superpower rival to Egypt for centuries, has simply ceased to exist. The Mycenaean palace culture, the civilization that had produced the heroes of the Iliad, collapsed so completely that Greece entered a dark age lasting 400 years, during which literacy itself was lost. The city of Ugarit was destroyed and never reoccupied. Cyprus was devastated, the palace economies of the Levant fragmented. Egypt survived, barely, and emerged from the crisis greatly diminished. For decades, the collapse was attributed to the Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders who appear in Egyptian records as foreign marauders attacking from the sea. The narrative was appealing. It had the simplicity of a named enemy, a cause equal to the effect. But the scholarship of the last 3 decades has complicated that narrative considerably. The archaeologist Eric Klein, in his comprehensive study of the Late Bronze Age collapse, argues that the civilization was destroyed not by any single cause, but by a perfect storm, a convergence of stresses so severe and so simultaneous that no individual crisis can be identified as primary. The evidence is overwhelming. Pollen records and isotope analysis show a severe and prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BCE across the eastern Mediterranean. Drought disrupted agriculture. Disrupted agriculture triggered famine. Famine triggered population movement, mass migrations of desperate people, the Sea Peoples themselves, likely among them, not powerful invaders, but climate refugees, driven by hunger into conflict with whoever stood between them and the next meal. Simultaneously, the palace economies, which were not separate autonomous states but deeply interdependent parts of a sophisticated international trade system, began to lose their supply chains. Without tin from Afghanistan, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no weapons and no agricultural tools. Without agricultural tools, crop yields fell further. The system was deeply interconnected, and its interconnection, which had been its greatest strength, became its most catastrophic vulnerability. Internal rebellion added another layer. In multiple sites, there is archaeological evidence of attacks on the palace centers from within. The very people who had been administered by these systems turning against the institutions that could no longer sustain them. Earthquakes struck multiple sites around the same period. A system's failure in one part of the network cascaded through trading relationships into failures elsewhere. The Late Bronze Age collapse is the clearest example in the archaeological record of what researchers now call a synchronous collapse, a failure mode in which the interdependence of a networked system means that the collapse of any major node triggers cascading failures throughout the entire network. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was not a collection of separate civilizations that happened to collapse at the same time. It was a single interconnected system, and it collapsed together because it was a system. This realization carries implications that extend well beyond the ancient world. The pattern that emerges from the forensic examination of collapsed civilizations is not a story of weakness. It is not a story of moral failure or of civilizations that deserved to end because they had grown corrupt or complacent. The Indus Valley cities were not corrupt. Angkor was not complacent. The classic Maya were not morally deficient. They were sophisticated, organized, resilient societies that had survived for centuries, had adapted to challenges that lesser institutions would not have survived, and had built systems of remarkable complexity and durability. They collapsed because they hit a threshold that their complexity could not transcend, because the stresses that converged upon them arrived faster than adaptation was possible, because the very attributes that made them great, the specialization, the long supply chains, and the institutional complexity, the population density, the agricultural intensification, made them, in certain conditions, brittle. There is a concept in ecology called the rigidity trap. It describes what happens to complex ecosystems that have optimized for efficiency to the point that they have lost flexibility. An ecosystem that has eliminated redundancy, that has every component operating at maximum capacity with no slack, becomes extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. That when a shock arrives, a drought, a disease, a sudden change in conditions, there is no buffer. There is no reserve capacity to absorb the stress. The system breaks rather than bends. Civilizations can fall into the same trap. The more sophisticated and interconnected they become, the more efficient they become. And the more efficient they become, the more they tend to eliminate the redundancies and reserves that would allow them to survive disruption. A city that feeds itself on a complex international supply chain is more prosperous than one that grows its own food. It is also more vulnerable to supply chain disruption. A political system that has centralized all administrative authority into a single capital is more efficient than a distributed one. It is also more vulnerable to the destruction or failure of that capital. Now consider the Maya specifically, because the Maya case offers a detail that the others lack: legibility. The Maya wrote things down. Their inscriptions have been decoded, and what they recorded in stone for what they intended to be eternity was the business of kings: wars, alliances, dynastic succession, ritual performance, astronomical calculation. The kings of the classic Maya period were not naive about power. They were sophisticated political actors embedded in complex interstate rivalries that had lasted for centuries. What the inscriptions do not record is any awareness that the civilization was ending. The monuments keep being built. The kings keep commissioning their inscriptions, right up to the point where the monuments stop. There is no text that says, "We understand that the rains have failed for 8 consecutive years, and our agricultural system cannot sustain the population, and our political rivals have cut our trade routes, and our cities are beginning to empty, and we do not know what to do." There is no evidence of institutional recognition that the threshold was being approached. The last dated inscription in the southern Maya lowlands comes from Tonina in 909 CE. It records a local king's victory in a war. And it is, as far as the archaeological record shows, one of the final acts of the classic Maya political tradition, a monument to a king, commissioned in the ordinary course of political life, in a civilization that was months or years from ceasing to function. They did not know it was the end. That is the detail that refuses to leave quietly. The historian Arnold Toynbee spent much of his career studying the rise and fall of civilizations, and arrived at a formulation that has proven difficult to dismiss. Civilizations do not die. They commit suicide. What he meant, stripped of the moralizing frame he sometimes applied to it, was that the decisions that ultimately cause civilizational collapse are usually made by the civilization itself, in response to pressures that are real and are usually reasonable responses given the information available at the time. The Maya kings who built defensive alliances and commissioned military monuments in the 9th century were not being foolish. They were responding to genuine political threats with the tools and frameworks available to them. The Angkorian engineers who built ever more elaborate hydraulic infrastructure were not being reckless. They were solving genuine problems with the best technology they had. The tragedy is not that they made bad decisions. The tragedy is that the accumulation of individually reasonable decisions, made in response to specific and immediate pressures, can produce collectively catastrophic outcomes that no individual decision-maker intended or foresaw. This is what the ruins are actually showing us, if we look carefully. Not the folly of weak civilizations, but the structural vulnerability of complex ones. Not a story about them, distant and safely past. A story about complexity itself, about the fundamental tension between the efficiency that makes civilizations great and the resilience that would allow them to survive. The archaeologist Arthur Demarest, who spent decades excavating Maya sites, described the collapse in terms that are worth sitting with. He said that the Maya were caught in a system that required constant escalation to maintain itself. Each city had to keep building, keep expanding, keep investing in political monuments and military capacity. Not because the moment they stopped, rival cities would gain the advantage. The system had no stable equilibrium. It was always accelerating. And a system that must always accelerate, that has no mechanism for deliberately choosing to slow down, will eventually hit a wall. Cities empty in stages, not all at once, not dramatically. First the outer precincts, then the neighborhoods furthest from the center. The agricultural population disperses first, only moving to areas where the land is still productive. The artisans follow, the merchants follow. The administrators, for a while, administer nothing, and the king, if the texts are any guide, keeps commissioning monuments, keeps performing the rituals, keeps asserting the permanence of the order he was born to maintain. And then he stops, and the jungle, which has been waiting at the edges of the cleared land for the entire duration of the civilization, begins to move inward. Knowledge disappears. This is perhaps the hardest aspect of civilizational collapse to fully absorb. When a complex society dissolves, it does not merely lose its political structures and its buildings. It loses the accumulated technical knowledge that kept those structures functioning. The engineers who designed Angkor's hydraulic system did not write down their knowledge in a form that survived the collapse. As the Indus Valley's writing system, which presumably encoded generations of administrative and technical knowledge, has never been deciphered and may never be, because the civilization that created it is gone. The Bronze Age scribal traditions of the Mycenaean Greeks, which had been adapted from earlier Minoan models and used to administer palace economies across the Aegean, disappeared so completely during the collapse that, when Greek literacy re-emerged 400 years later, it used a completely different writing system, borrowed from the Phoenicians. 400 years of illiteracy, in a civilization that had been producing sophisticated administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, and literary texts. 4 centuries of darkness in which the skills and knowledge encoded in those texts simply did not exist in that part of the world. Collapse does not preserve what was built, it erases it. History remembers empires, though the ones with enough narrative gravity to pull future civilizations into their orbit. Rome, Greece, Egypt, Han China. Their monuments were maintained, or at least visited. Their names were kept. Their languages shaped the languages that came after. But beneath the surface of the history we tell ourselves, there is a graveyard. Cities that were never named in the texts of their conquerors because their conquerors did not outlast them. Yes, civilizations whose names we do not know because the people who carried those names are gone. Languages encoded in undeciphered scripts, sealing off entire worlds of human thought and experience behind walls that have not yet been opened and may never be. The ruins scattered across this planet, in the jungles of Guatemala, in the floodplains of Pakistan, under the rice paddies of Cambodia, on the Great Plains of Illinois, on the granite plateau of Zimbabwe, are not archaeological curiosities. They are not tourist destinations or subjects for documentary films, though they are both of those things. They are data, specific, hard-won, forensically retrieved data about what happens to complex civilizations under stress. The data is consistent. It does not tell a story about weakness. It does not tell a story about moral failure. It tells a story about thresholds, about the gap between the complexity a civilization builds and the resilience that complexity can sustain. It is about the speed at which multiple converging stresses can overwhelm institutional response capacity, about the way in which the very attributes that make a civilization powerful, its interconnectedness, its specialization, its efficiency, its scale, become, in the wrong conditions, the mechanisms of its dissolution. The Indus Valley engineers did not build those perfect drains expecting to be forgotten. Even the Maya astronomers who calculated the movements of Venus across centuries did not track time with such precision because they expected time to run out. The Khmer architects who built Angkor Wat, a structure so precisely oriented to the cardinal directions that it functions as an astronomical instrument, a monument to the permanence of cosmic order, did not carve those stones imagining the day when no one would know their names. They built for permanence. They built as if the order they inhabited was the natural order of things, as if the complexity they had constructed would sustain itself indefinitely because it had sustained itself so far. This is what Arthur Demarest meant. This is what the ruins keep saying, in the language of empty rooms and overgrown plazas and sealed scripts that no living person can read. Civilizations do not collapse because they are weak. They collapse because they believe they are permanent. The unfinished fresco in the evacuated house at Akrotiri, the unsent letters sealed in clay at Ugarit, the last Maya monument carved by a king who had no reason to believe it would be the last one. The grain carbonized in the oven at Mohenjo-Daro, waiting for a baker who never came back. These are not the artifacts of civilizations that knew they were ending. They are the artifacts of civilizations that thought they had more time, that assumed the next season would resemble the last one. That trusted the systems they had built, because those systems had always worked before. Every civilization that has ever existed has been, at some point in its history, the most sophisticated thing the human species had ever produced. The Indus Valley cities, at their height, represented the largest planned urban settlements on Earth. The classic Maya represented the most complex state systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. Angkor represented the largest urban footprint in the pre-industrial world. Each of them was, in the era of their greatest flourishing, the pinnacle, and each of them is, now, a ruin. The question the ruins ask, the question they have always been asking across the centuries that separate their abandonment from our examination of them, is not what went wrong. We know broadly what went wrong. Climate changed, pressures converged, thresholds were crossed. If the question the ruins ask is a different one, the question is, who, standing in the midst of the greatest civilization they had ever known, would have believed it could end? And the answer, inscribed in the last monuments of the Maya, in the unsent letters of Ugarit, in the unfinished fresco of Akrotiri, in the grain left in the oven at Mohenjo-Daro, is that no one did. No one ever does. Which civilization's collapse haunts you most? And do you see any of these patterns in the world today? Leave your theories in the comments below.